Science fiction during the Cold War wasn't just about rockets and shiny heroes. Sometimes it was about ideas so strange, so daring, that they never made it across the ocean. While Americans were lining up for pulp adventures and space cowboys, the Soviet Union was quietly building a library of films that blended philosophy, surrealism, and visuals that still feel ahead of their time. But which forgotten gems are waiting to be rediscovered? Let's open the vault and uncover 12 Soviet sci-fi deep cuts you probably never heard of. The Heavens Call 1960. Before Yuri Gagarin rocketed into history, Soviet filmmakers were already imagining humanity's first steps toward Mars. The Heavens Call, directed by Mikhail Karzhukov and Alexander Kozyr, was nothing short of a cinematic prophecy. This wasn't a small studio project. It was a national statement dressed up as an adventure. The film follows two rival crews racing toward the Red Planet, one Soviet and one American, a story that mirrored the growing tension in the real space race. But here's the twist. In this version, cooperation wins. The two crews eventually combined their efforts, turning competition into collaboration, a message that was both utopian and politically loaded. What makes this film fascinating isn't just the plot, but the visuals. Using elaborate model work, sprawling sets, and eerie landscapes of Mars, it created a world that looked nothing like Hollywood's glossy rockets. Instead, the design leaned on Soviet engineering aesthetics, chunky, industrial, and oddly realistic. And yet, when American producer Roger Corman later acquired the film, he chopped it up, redubbed it, and rebranded it as Battle Beyond the Sun for US audiences. Gone was the political edge, replaced with stock monsters and cheesy dialogue. Ironically, many American sci-fi fans ended up watching parts of this Soviet vision without even realizing it. For Soviet viewers in 1960, The Heavens Call wasn't just a movie. It was a glimpse of what might come if the USSR's dreams of space exploration actually took off. For modern audiences, it stands as a time capsule of Cold War optimism, a cinematic relic that dared to show rivals working together long before détente. Today, you can find copies floating around online, and when you do, you'll see why it's remembered as the film that tried to point Mars-bound cinema in a new direction. Storm Planet 1961. 1 year later, another film tried to push Soviet sci-fi even further into the unknown. Storm Planet, sometimes called Planet Burr, is one of those lost treasures that has been overshadowed by its louder cousin, Planet of Storms. Directed by Pavel Klushantsev, it tells the story of cosmonauts sent to Venus, who face not only hostile terrain, but also the limits of human resilience. And make no mistake, this isn't a cheerful space jaunt. From the very first moments, the film immerses you in a world where exploration feels like a gamble with nature itself. The visuals are stunning for their time. Jagged volcanic mountains, rivers of lava, and atmospheric effects that make Venus feel like a place you could reach out and touch. Instead of leaning on wild fantasy, the design here feels grounded, almost predictive of what scientists later confirmed about Venus's inhospitable climate. There's even an early attempt at a robot sidekick, though unlike Hollywood's slick machines, this one is bulky, clunky, and oddly human in its fragility. It's not a superhero robot, it's a reminder of how dependent humans are on imperfect tools. What makes Storm Planet special is its mood. Where American sci-fi of the early 60s often leaned into campy monsters or melodramatic heroes, this film embraces uncertainty. Every step on Venus feels dangerous. Every scene hums with the possibility of disaster. And beneath the adventure is a quiet layer of commentary. The triumph of science, the fear of the unknown, and the reminder that progress always comes at a cost. For audiences in the Soviet Union, Storm Planet was a spectacle, a bold attempt to match the country's real-world achievements in space. For today's viewers, it's a deep cut worth tracking down, because it shows how far ahead Soviet filmmakers were willing to dream. Watching it now feels like stumbling onto a forgotten blueprint of cosmic storytelling, one that Hollywood only borrowed pieces from years later. The Hyperboloid of Engineer Garin, 1965. Sometimes Soviet science fiction left the stars behind and looked inward at humanity's dangerous ambitions. The Hyperboloid of Engineer Garin, based on Alexei Tolstoy's 1927 novel, is one of the strangest blends of sci-fi and social critique ever put on film. Instead of astronauts, the story centers on a brilliant but dangerously arrogant engineer who invents a powerful energy device. This hyperboloid isn't just a futuristic tool, It's a symbol of unchecked ambition, greed, and the temptation to bend the world to one man's vision. Visually, the film is moody, almost noir-like, with sharp lighting and a sense of paranoia that hangs over every frame. The hyperboloid itself glows with an eerie, almost supernatural power, becoming less a machine and more a character in its own right. Unlike flashy Western gadgets, this invention is treated with fear, as though the filmmakers were warning viewers about the dark side of progress. What makes the movie stand out is its refusal to glorify its protagonist. Garen isn't a hero, he's a cautionary tale. His obsession with power isolates him, corrupts him, and ultimately makes him a tragic figure rather than a triumphant genius. In that sense, the film feels almost timeless. Replace the hyperboloid with any groundbreaking technology, and the story still resonates today. For audiences in the 1,960 seconds, this film was unnerving. It wasn't a tale of cosmic adventure or dreamy utopia. It was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of a society racing forward with inventions it barely understood. While Americans rarely encountered this movie, it became a cult piece in the Soviet Union, admired for its daring critique. Watching it now, you can see why it endures. It's not just science fiction. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't waiting in space, they're in our own inventions. The Mysterious Wall, 1967. What if humanity's first alien encounter wasn't with creatures, but with silence? That's the chilling premise of The Mysterious Wall, a film almost completely unknown in the West. Imagine this. A glowing, impenetrable barrier suddenly appears on Earth, stretching across the landscape like a frozen wave of light. Scientists rush to study it, soldiers hover nervously nearby, and the entire nation wonders, what's behind it? The brilliance of this film lies in what it doesn't reveal. There are no bug-eyed monsters or grand battles. Instead, the wall simply exists, inscrutable and unyielding, daring humanity to confront something it can't explain or control. The scientists in the film probe it with instruments, launch theories, even risk their lives by getting too close, but the wall gives them nothing. It's the ultimate enigma, a silent message from the cosmos that leaves humanity humbled. Visually, the film captures the atmosphere of awe and dread perfectly. The glowing barrier looks alien yet strangely beautiful, a work of practical effects that still feels unsettling today. Every frame crackles with tension, not from action, but from anticipation. You keep waiting for the wall to answer, but it never does. For Soviet audiences, in 1967, this was heady stuff. While American films were busy imagining alien invasions or intergalactic wars, The Mysterious Wall forced viewers to grapple with the possibility that first contact might not be violent or even understandable. It might be something that shakes human arrogance to the core. Watching it today, the film feels ahead of its time, almost like a spiritual cousin to Arrival or 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's not about what's out there, but about how small we are in the face of it. A true deep cut. This is one of those films that makes you realize just how strange and ambitious Soviet sci-fi could be when it broke away from propaganda. Planet of the Storms 1962. When people talk about Soviet sci-fi, Planet of the Storms often gets lost in the shuffle, but it shouldn't. Directed by Pavel Klashantsev, one of the great visionaries of Soviet special effects, this movie is a dazzling mix of adventure, imagination, and eerie science speculation. The story follows a group of cosmonauts attempting to land on Venus. What they find is a landscape filled with bubbling lava, towering volcanoes, dense jungles, and even dinosaur-like creatures roaming the planet's surface. Visually, Planet of the Storms was extraordinary for its time. The practical effects and miniatures gave Venus a tactile, otherworldly feel. You can almost feel the heat of the lava flows and the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on the explorers. The real showstealer, though, was the robot companion named John. Clunky, yet strangely endearing, John helps the cosmonauts survive the harsh environment, and he became one of the film's most memorable elements, a Soviet answer to the idea of human-machine partnership. Here's where things get really interesting. American producer Roger Corman later bought the rights to the film, chopped it up, added new footage, and re-released it as Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet, and later as Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women. In other words, Western audiences actually saw parts of Planet of the Storms without realizing it was Soviet sci-fi at all. The fact that Hollywood mined it for content says everything about how far ahead of the curve Khrushchev really was. For Soviet viewers, this film wasn't just spectacle, it was a statement of pride, tying the country's real achievements in space exploration to the boundless possibilities of the cosmos. For modern audiences, it's a fascinating relic, not just because of its impressive visuals, but because it captures the excitement and terror of exploring an unknown world. Watch it today, and you'll see why this forgotten gem deserves to be remembered as one of the most important sci-fi adventures of its era. Eerie XB11963. If you want proof that Eastern Bloc cinema could outdream Hollywood, look no further than Eerie XB1. Though technically a Czechoslovak production, it was distributed widely in the Soviet Union and deserves a place on this list. The film follows the crew of the spaceship Ikari on a decades-long mission to Alpha Centauri, and from the opening minutes, it feels like something light years ahead of its time. Instead of treating space as a playground for action heroes, the movie dives into the quiet rhythms of life on board a starship. We see the crew exercising, eating, celebrating birthdays, and wrestling with boredom. That might sound slow, but it gives the journey a startling realism. These aren't cardboard astronauts. They're people with emotions, conflicts, and doubts. The real fireworks come when the crew encounters a derelict vessel drifting in space. Inside, they find haunting signs of catastrophe, a floating reminder of how fragile civilizations can be. This sequence, with its eerie silence and unsettling imagery, prefigured the mood of Alien years later. And visually, the film dazzles, sleek starship corridors, hypnotic model work, and a sense of scale that made Western sci-fi look clunky by comparison. For audiences, in 1963, Eerie XB1 was a revelation. It presented a vision of space travel as both hopeful and terrifying, where technology advanced, but human frailties remained the same. The film was later recut and poorly dubbed in the US under the title Voyage to the End of the Universe, stripped of its intelligence and atmosphere. But the original is the one worth watching. Today, Eerie XB1 stands as a crown jewel of Eastern European sci-fi, overlooked by most American fans. It's less a popcorn ride and more a haunting meditation on what happens when humanity leaves Earth behind. Dead Mountaineers Hotel, 1979. Imagine a snow-covered resort in the middle of nowhere, cut off from the world by avalanches. Now imagine that inside, guests start acting strange, as if they're not who they claim to be. That's the chilling setup for Dead Mountaineers Hotel, an Estonian film based on a novel by the legendary Strugatsky brothers. At first glance, it plays like a detective mystery. A police inspector arrives to investigate suspicious happenings at the hotel, but as the story unfolds, it becomes clear this isn't an ordinary crime story. Something alien lurks beneath the surface. The strength of the film lies in its atmosphere. Snow howls outside the windows, shadows stretch across wooden halls. The guests seem normal until they don't, and the inspector finds himself unraveling a puzzle where the answers feel increasingly unearthly. There are no flashy special effects here, just mood, silence, and the creeping sense that the rules of reality are bending. What makes Dead Mountaineers Hotel fascinating is how it merges genres. It's part noir, part ghost story, and part science fiction. The Strugatskys used the story as a metaphor for human suspicion and fear of outsiders, themes that resonated deeply in the late Soviet era. By the time the inspector realizes what's really happening, it's too late, and the ending leaves you with more questions than answers. For Western audiences, this is one of the ultimate deep cuts. It's rarely mentioned in conversations about Soviet cinema, yet it's as gripping and eerie as anything from that era. Watching it feels like stumbling across a lost episode of The Twilight Zone, shot in a frozen wilderness. For fans of slow-burn suspense, this one is a revelation. Test Pilot Perks, 1979. By the late 70s, the Soviet Union and its allies were willing to take risks with their science fiction, and Test Pilot Perks is proof. A Soviet-Polish co-production adapted from a story by Stanisław Lem. This film asks one of the most unsettling questions of the era. What if machines became so lifelike that we couldn't tell them from ourselves? The story follows Commander Perks, a seasoned space pilot assigned to lead a mission that secretly doubles as a test. Among his crew are androids indistinguishable from humans. His job is to figure out which ones they are without sparking panic or destroying the mission. From the start, paranoia seeps into every scene. Is the quiet engineer really human? What about the calm navigator? Every conversation carries the weight of suspicion. Visually, the film balances stark realism with eerie unease. The spacecraft interiors are utilitarian, full of blinking panels and mechanical hums. Yet the real tension comes from the human faces staring back at Pyrrhus, never revealing whether they're flesh or machine. It's less about laser battles and more about the psychology of trust. For Soviet audiences, test pilot Pyrrhus was both exciting and unnerving. It reflected real anxieties about technology, automation, and whether humanity might create tools that could outthink their creators. For Americans, the concept might sound familiar, themes later echoed in Blade Runner and Battlestar Galactica. But here, it was explored with a slower, colder intensity that leaves you unsettled long after the credits roll. This film is the definition of a deep cut, little known outside Eastern Europe, yet profoundly influential in its ideas. Watch it today, and you'll realize the questions it asks are still as relevant, maybe even more so. Professor Dowell's Testament, 1984. Every great sci-fi tradition has its mad scientist tale, and for the Soviet Union, that story was Professor Dowell's Testament. Loosely adapted from Alexander Belyev's novel, the film tells of a brilliant professor whose experiments with life and death go too far. After his sudden demise, his assistant carries on his work, reanimating heads and bodies in the name of science. What follows is part cautionary tale, part surreal nightmare, wrapped in a uniquely Soviet sense of morality. Visually, the film feels like something caught between gothic horror and futuristic speculation. Stark laboratories with gleaming instruments, glowing liquids, and disembodied heads preserved in tanks, all of it has an eerie weight, like Frankenstein reimagined through a Cold War lens. But the real focus isn't on spectacle, it's on the ethical questions the story raises. Should science tamper with the very boundaries of life? What happens when curiosity tramples over compassion? Unlike Western versions of this theme, which often leaned into shock value, Professor Dowell's Testament plays it straight. It's tragic, unsettling, and strangely intimate. Characters wrestle with guilt, ambition, and the consequences of playing God with human flesh. For Soviet audiences, this wasn't just macabre entertainment. It was a reminder that progress without conscience could lead to disasters even worse than failure. What makes the film a deep cut is its quiet power. It's not as well known as Tarkovsky's masterpieces, nor as spectacular as Per Aspera ad Astra, but it lingers in the mind. Watch it today, and you'll see how Soviet cinema explored not only space and technology, but also the fragile line between innovation and hubris. The Silence of Dr. Evans, 1973. Some Soviet sci-fi preferred mystery over spectacle, and The Silence of Dr. Evans is a perfect example. Directed by Budimir Metalnikov, this film starts with a bang, a mysterious crash landing of an alien craft on Earth. But instead of unleashing monsters or chaos, the story turns quiet, meditative, and deeply human. Dr. Evans, the central figure, is tasked with studying the lone survivor of the crash, a being who looks human but refuses to speak. The silence becomes the film's haunting core. Is this visitor dangerous? Is he a messenger? Or is his silence a deliberate test of human patience and compassion? Scene after scene unfolds with tense stillness, where looks and gestures say more than words ever could. Visually, the film is understated. No glittering space stations or elaborate costumes. Instead, it grounds the mystery in earthly settings, letting the alien presence feel even more out of place. The suspense doesn't come from action, but from waiting, watching the struggle between fear, empathy, and the unknown. For Soviet viewers in 1973, this film was unusual. It avoided bombast and propaganda in favor of ambiguity. Instead of showing progress, it showed humility. In many ways, it anticipated later Western films like The Man Who Fell to Earth, which also used alien contact as a metaphor for human weakness. As a deep cut, The Silence of Dr. Evans is rarely mentioned, even in sci-fi circles, but it deserves rediscovery. It's not a movie that gives you answers. It's a movie that teaches you to live with questions. Solaris 1972. You might be tempted to say, wait, Solaris isn't Overlooked. But here's the catch. The version most Americans know is the 2002 remake with George Clooney, or the Cliff Notes reputation as the Soviet 2001. What often gets overlooked is just how different Tarkovsky's original film really is. and how much of it never truly crossed over to Western audiences in its raw form. At its heart, Solaris isn't about space at all. It's about memory, grief, and the unbearable weight of love. Psychologist Chris Kelvin arrives at a space station orbiting the living planet Solaris, only to discover that the planet has the ability to materialize human memories. For Kelvin, that means being confronted with his late wife, recreated not as she was, but as a ghost, shaped by his guilt. Tarkovsky's Solaris unfolds slowly, hypnotically, with long takes that force you to sit with the character's emotions. The planet itself is a visual marvel, an endless ocean of shifting patterns, more like a subconscious mind than a celestial body. Hollywood never dared to approach sci-fi like this. Instead of explosions and discovery, the film offered silence, sorrow, and the terror of facing yourself. For Soviet audiences, Solaris was revolutionary. It dared to challenge the idea that progress was enough, suggesting instead that technology could never mend the human soul. For modern viewers, it remains one of the greatest works of psychological sci-fi ever made. But here's the truth. Most Americans have only seen the remake, or heard the reputation. Tarkovsky's original is the real experience, and it's a deep cut worth revisiting in its full, haunting glory. Moscow Cassiopeia 1974. Not every Soviet sci-fi film was grim or philosophical. Some were bright bursts of optimism, and Moscow Cassiopeia is one of the best examples. Released in 1974 and directed by Richard Viktorov, this film aimed straight at the younger generation, and in doing so, it created one of the most unusual space adventures of the Cold War era. The setup is irresistible. Earth receives a signal from Cassiopeia, a star system far away, and scientists decide to send a mission. But because the journey will take decades, the crew must be teenagers who will still be alive when the ship arrives. Suddenly, Soviet classrooms become recruiting grounds for the galaxy's youngest astronauts. The film follows this group of bright-eyed teens as they blast off, bringing their curiosity, humor, and mistakes with them into the great unknown. Visually, Moscow Cassiopeia is colorful and almost playful. The spaceship interiors look futuristic but not intimidating, and the costumes balance science fiction sleekness with youthful energy. Instead of tense, brooding atmosphere, the movie bursts with discovery and childlike wonder. It's less about survival and more about exploration, like a comic book brought to life, only with a distinctly Soviet twist. For Soviet audiences, in the mid-70 seconds, this film was electrifying. It suggested that the space race wasn't just about hardened cosmonauts or military glory. It was about the future, and that future belonged to the young. At a time when propaganda was everywhere, Moscow Cassiopeia felt refreshingly hopeful, showing kids not as bystanders, but as pilots of destiny. For Western viewers who stumble across it today, the film is a curiosity, a rare glimpse at how the USSR tried to inspire its youth through sci-fi. It's cheerful, idealistic, and charmingly retro, standing out as one of the few Cold War films that felt more like a pep talk than a warning. So, there you have it. 12 overlooked Soviet sci-fi deep cuts that prove imagination doesn't always need rockets and ray guns to shake your soul. From glowing alien walls to haunted snowbound hotels, these films show a side of Cold War cinema to Americans rarely saw. Which of these strange visions grabbed your attention the most? Drop a comment, share this with a fellow film fan, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden treasures. After all, the Cold War may be history, but its wildest dreams are still waiting to be rediscovered.